Today we are going to learn system design from a project manager's perspective. Most crash courses teach concepts individually. Load balancers, caching, databases, messaging queues, and so on. But we are going to take a different approach. How this course will work is instead of learning components in isolation, we are going to build a system from scratch. We will start with the simplest possible architecture, a client and a server, and then we'll deliberately break it. As new problems appear, we will introduce the architectural components that will solve those problems. For examples, when more users will arrive, servers will become overloaded, latency will increase, databases become bottlenecks, and every time the system will break, we will improve the architecture. By the end of this course, you will understand how large systems are built, how each component exists, how components interact with each other, how scalable architectures evolve over time. This mental model is incredibly useful for system design interviews and for working effectively with engineering teams. Now for the simplest architecture, client and server. A client wants to access a server. The challenge is that the client doesn't know the server's IP address. Instead, it only knows a domain name, such as example.com. Right? So, how does the client find the server? The solution is DNS resolution. Before communicating with the server, the client must convert the domain name into an IP address. To do this, it contacts a DNS resolver. DNS is basically a domain name system. A client contacts the DNS resolver, and the DNS resolver takes the URL from the client and returns the corresponding IP address of the website. So the DNS resolver will translate example.com into something like 192.115.16.28, which is an IP address. Now, once the client receives the IP address, it knows where the server is located. Now that the client knows the server's IP address, it can establish a TCP connection. So the communication flow looks like this. The client sends a TCP connection over to the server. It sends a request, and the server processes the request and sends back a response. This request and response pattern, it forms the foundation of almost every internet application. The request response pattern we studied is called HTTP, Hypertext Transfer Protocol. But it is important to note that in modern applications, we do not use plain HTTP. Instead, we use something called HTTPS. Because HTTPS encrypts communication between the client and the server, thereby making the connection secure. So whenever users log in, make payments, or exchange sensitive information, HTTPS protects the data during transmission. Now let's say your system gets popular. Your application becomes successful. Initially, you had 2-3 users per day, and then suddenly there's like 10,000 users per day. So the servers naturally would be under pressure. To handle the additional traffic, you might increase the RAM, CPU, or the storage of the server. This approach is called vertical scaling. Vertical scaling is basically making the machine more powerful. So you can increase the CPU, RAM, storage, basically the processing power of your server, and for a while, this works perfectly. But the problem is vertical scaling has its limits. Imagine your application grows even further. Instead of 10,000 users, you now have 1 million users. Can you keep adding the RAM forever? Can you keep adding the CPU forever? No, because every machine will reach a physical limit. Eventually, you'll reach a point where the server cannot be upgraded any further. And that right there is the problem. You still have one server, which means if that fails, your entire system would fail. This is what we call a single point of failure. And this is solved by horizontal scaling. To solve this problem, we move from vertical scaling to horizontal scaling. Instead of making one server bigger, we add more servers. Instead of one server, now you can add three. Automatically, the system becomes more resilient. So if server 1 was to fail, server 2 and 3 can take up the load. An application can continue serving the users. This eliminates the single point of failure and increases the capacity significantly. Horizontal scaling solves one problem, but it does create another. The client still knows only one destination, only one server. How will it decide which server does it need to talk to? Server 1, server 2 or server 3? And the client shouldn't make this decision. So we need another component to handle it. And that is called a load balancer. A load balancer sits between clients and the application servers. So instead of sending requests directly to the server, client sends the request to the load balancer. The load balancer receives the incoming request and decides which server should process them. Its primary responsibility is to distribute the traffic, is to make sure the system has high availability. Automatically that creates fault tolerance and basically it leads to efficient resource utilization. But how does it decide where each request should go? And this is decided by load balancing algorithms. I think the simplest algorithm would be round robin. So the load balancer here would distribute requests evenly across the server. For example, request 1 would go to app server 1, request 2 to app server 2, request 3 to app server 3. Now fourth request will go back to application server 1, fifth to application server 2, and so on and so forth. Every server gets an equal share of traffic. Round robin works well when requests are similar in complexity, processing time is roughly equal, and the workload is predictable. In theory, it's very simple and very effective. But of course, real world traffic isn't always uniform, so round robin can back hit. There's another algorithm which is called the least connections. Because not every request will take the same amount of time. Let's say application 1, application server 1 is processing a 5-second request. Server 2 is processing a 1-second request. And server 3 is processing a 3-second request. Now if a new request will arrive, which server should receive it? The answer is application 2. Why? Because that server has finished its work first and has the fewest number of active connections. This approach is called least connections. The load balancer would continuously monitor active connections and routes the new request to the least busy server. Right? So this automatically becomes more efficient. It will continuously monitor which are the active connections and it will route the request to the least busy server. This strategy will work particularly well when request processing times will vary significantly. Now you might think, if least connections algorithm works so well, why do we even need another algorithm? The problem lies in session persistence. Sometimes we want a particular user to consistently reach the same server. This is also called a sticky session. And why do we want that? Because some applications store temporary session data on a server. But if a user will keep switching between the servers, that context will be lost. So IP hashing solves this problem by consistently mapping a client's IP address to the same server. This ensures the server retains the context across multiple requests. Now, we understand how a load balancer will distribute the traffic. The next question is, how much information does the load balancer inspect before making its decision? The answer lies depending on whether the load balancer is operating at a layer 4 or a layer 7. Let's dive deep into it. Layer 4 load balancers operate at the transport layer. They make routing decisions using IP address and TCP port. They do not inspect the actual contents of the request. This means they would not know which API is being called, which user is making the request, whether the request is for an image or for a video. Because they inspect less information, they are faster, more lightweight, and very efficient. But of course, because they are inspecting less information, they are less intelligent as well. Now, when we talk about layer 7 load balancers, modern applications typically use these load balancers. They operate at the application layer. And unlike layer 4, they can understand the content of your request. They can inspect the URL paths, the headers, the cookies, the request types. For example, a URL saying API users can be routed to application servers, while a URL with images logo.png, it can be routed to a file server or a CDN. Because it inspected the contents, it makes far more intelligent decisions. It understands what the request is trying to do before deciding where it should go. Most modern cloud environments use layer 7 load balancers. Examples would be AWS, Nginx, and cloud native API gateways. These solutions provide advanced routing capabilities based on application level information rather than just network information. Let's also talk about health checks. A load balancer does more than just route traffic. It is also continuously monitoring the server health. Think of it as asking each server, "Are you alive?" And it asks this question at regular intervals. So if a server stops responding in the middle, the load balancer automatically will remove it from the rotation. So if suddenly application server 2 stops responding, the new traffic is sent only to the healthy servers application server 1 and 2 and 3. Users continue using the application without noticing that the server has failed. This is one of the key reasons load balancers are so essential in highly available systems. Now here comes another question. Can the load balancer itself become a single point of failure? Because if the load balancer itself fails, wouldn't the entire application become unavailable? And the answer is yes. A load balancer can also become a single point of failure. And because of this, we need redundant load balancers. We need to deploy multiple load balancers. Again, we have two approaches here. The first is active-active. For example, we deployed 2 load balancers. Both these load balancers serve the traffic simultaneously. We also have an active-passive strategy where there is a standby load balancer, but it is remaining on standby doing nothing, and it will only take over if the primary load balancer should fail. In practice, engineers do not configure this manually, and cloud providers actually handle this complexity for us. So you typically do not need to worry about the load balancer becoming a single point of failure. But let's get back to our system now. Our system now is horizontally scalable, fault tolerant, and highly available. But another problem appears. Let's say our servers are located in Texas, USA. Users are now accessing the application from Singapore, Mumbai, London, Sydney. So every request will have to travel thousands of miles before reaching the server. This will of course increase the network latency significantly. And even if my servers are fast, user will experience delays because the data has to travel across the entire globe. And because of this issue, we introduced the CDN. CDN is basically the content delivery network. It is a globally distributed network of servers placed close to users around the world. These servers might also be called edge servers, edge nodes, or point of presence. And the basic utility is that instead of serving content from a single location, we are now serving it from the nearest edge location. So when you're watching a movie on Netflix, it's not streaming directly from USA. It's actually streaming directly from your edge server, which might be in your own city. So how does a CDN reduce latency? Let's say, imagine a user in Singapore is requesting an image. So without a CDN, the Singapore user will have to connect to the Texas server. The request will travel across the globe, and with a CDN, the Singapore user will probably have to connect with the edge node somewhere in Asia. So the content is delivered from a nearby location. It does not have to travel the entire globe. This dramatically reduces latency and improves page load times. Let's also understand what happens when a user requests a static file. Static file is something that will not change. So at the time of the first request, the file is not present in the edge node. This situation is called a cache miss. So the user will request to the CDN edge node. There will be a cache miss. It does not have this particular picture in store, and it will go to the origin server somewhere in Texas. And it will fetch the file from the original Texas server. Of course, this will take a lot of time. There will be latency. But then it will store a local copy in the edge server, and it will return the file to the user. Now when there's a second and a third request, or for any future request, this time the file already exists inside the edge node. And this is called a cache hit. So the user connects to the CDN edge node, it finds the file there, and the file is returned to the user. And this process will be significantly faster. Now let's talk about what data should be actually stored in a CDN. CDNs are ideal only for static content. Your examples would be images, videos, audio files, CSS files, something that's not going to change. Now let's talk about what should not be stored in a CDN. Dynamic content should generally not be cached in a CDN. Examples would be user-specific API responses, shopping cart contents, session data. And why? Because this data is changing frequently, so it must usually be generated by the original server. When we're talking about cache, let's also talk about cache invalidation. Caching, as we saw, improves performance, but it creates a new challenge. What happens when the content changes? Suppose a file stored in the CDN gets updated. If the CDN continues to serve the old version, users will never see the latest content. And this problem is called cache invalidation. This is one of the most important topics in distributed systems. We need to invalidate the data residing inside the cache. The first strategy we have for this is time to live. So the simplest solution is for each entry to be assigned a TTL value, time to live. So the file can expire after an hour. Once the TTL expires, the cached file is automatically removed. The next request will then fetch a fresh copy from the original server. Strategy 2 is called versioned file names. This is another common approach. So instead of reusing the same file name, we generate a new file name whenever the file changes. So for example, if your file name was A1B2, after deployment, it would be A1B2C3. After another deployment, it will be A1B2C4, right? Because the file name is changing, the CDN will treat it as a completely new file. And so this will guarantee that the users will receive the latest version and not the old version. The next bottleneck here will be database reads. At this point, static content is served by the CDN and global latency is reduced. But another problem is every dynamic request
request that will need to change, it still is going to the database. And a database query will take somewhere around 50 to 500 milliseconds. And this might not sound like much, but imagine a user profile or a product page being requested thousands and thousands of times per second. And we are repeatedly querying the database for information that is barely changing. This will create a very unnecessary load and eventually it will become a bottleneck. So can we somehow serve the frequently accessed data without hitting the database every time? This is where in-memory caching systems such as Redis comes into the picture. So far, every dynamic request was hitting the database, right? But as traffic goes, the database is becoming a bottleneck. So to solve this, we introduce in-memory cache. Typically, you might have heard of Redis cache. So Redis cache or just in-memory cache will be sitting in between the application and the database. And Redis will store the frequently accessed data directly in its memory. This frequently accessed data might be user profiles, some product pages, some popular products, some popular user profiles, some configuration data. So the key advantage of Redis is its speed. Instead of milliseconds, now this access is happening in nanoseconds. So accessing data from memory is orders of magnitude faster than querying a database. And that's why employing a Redis can dramatically reduce response times and database load. Redis is more than just a cache. It's actually an in-memory data store that supports rich data structures such as strings, hash, list, sets. In interviews, it's useful to mention that Redis is simply not a key value storage. It provides multiple optimized data structures for different use cases. While we are talking about Redis and caches, let's talk about some strategies. Caching is not just about reading data. We also need to decide how writes should behave. There are two common approaches here. First is the write-through cache. With write-through, every write goes to both the database and the cache at the same time. So write request will go to the cache and the database. The benefit here would be cache would always remain synchronized and reads will always be consistent. But the drawback is you pay the cost of updating the cache even for the data that may never be read again. And that is why we have another strategy called the write back cache. With write back, data is first written to the cache. The cache then flushes this data to the database in the background. The benefit here is that writes become very fast and the database load is also decreased. But the problem is that there is a risk of data loss. Because if the cache crashes before flushing the data to the database, the update might be lost. And this is the trade-off between performance and durability. Also, you might wonder, what will happen when the cache is full? Because the cache has limited memory. Eventually, we need to remove old data to make room for new data. And this process is called cache eviction. We again have strategies for that. The first is LRU. LRU basically stands for removing the items that haven't been accessed for the longest time. This is one of the most efficient cache eviction strategies. There's another one called LFU, which is the least frequently used, where we remove the items that have been accessed the least number of times. It works well when certain records are consistently more popular than the others. Again, we also have TTL, which basically assigns some time to each entry, and once the timer expires, the entry is automatically removed. Another issue comes, which is a cache stampede. Imagine a highly popular cache key suddenly expires. It is highly popular, so obviously there will be a lot of requests now. And all of these requests will result in a miss. because the data is no longer in Redis. And every request will go directly to the database. And this sudden spike can obviously overwhelm the database. And this is what we call a cache stampede. How do we solve for it? The solution is to allow only one request to rebuild the cache. Okay, so what happens is the first request fetches the data from the database. It then populates the Redis. All the other requests will wait and then it will subsequently read from the updated cache. Basically, instead of getting 1,000 requests at the same time, there will be a lock on how many requests can go ahead and do a database search. So only one request will proceed, it will rebuild the cache, and then the updated cache will cater to the rest of the 900 requests that are coming in. This prevents the database from being flooded. Also, there's a problem called cold start cache. Let's suppose you deploy a brand new cache. Initially, it would obviously be empty. So the first wave of requests would not find anything in the cache and every request will go hit the database. This is what we call the cold start. And that's a fairly popular problem, but we figured out the issue here. We can pre-warm the cache. To avoid a cold start, we pre-populate the cache with frequently accessed data. So popular products, popular profiles, popular queries, these are entered into the cache before serving any real traffic. This ensures that even the first request will benefit from the caching. Now let's talk about the next scaling concern. Caching has helped us, but eventually the application will grow further. Imagine 10 million users. At this scale, a single database will become the bottleneck sooner rather than later. So even if you cache all the reads, the database still has storage and write limits. And so eventually we will need to do database replication.
So imagine we have 10 million read requests and 1,000 write requests. If every read and write hits the same database server, it will quickly become overloaded. The challenge is that most applications receive far more reads than writes. So instead of scaling the entire database, we can separate the read and write responsibilities. We introduce database replication. Database replication basically has a primary database who only does the writes. And then we have the replicas. These are the secondary databases and they only perform the reads. So your primary database will become the single source of truth. And its responsibility will be to handle all the writes, store the latest data, and replicate the updates to all the replica databases. And the replica databases in turn will handle the read traffic. They will reduce the load on the primary database and basically improve the scalability. So how does a request flow look like? A write request will go directly to the primary database, but a read request will go to the replica database. And instead of one database handling millions of reads, now the load is distributed across multiple replicas. And this will increase your read scalability. But what will happen if the primary database fails? Because it's a single point of failure, right? So to solve this, we perform a leader election. So far, the primary databases are leader. But if it goes down, then one of the replicas will be promoted. And the remaining replicas will continue to serve the reads. This will allow the system to recover without any manual intervention. Also note that this replication is not instantaneous. Whenever data is written to the primary database, the replicas will receive that update shortly afterwards. This little delay is called replication lag. So for example, if a user updates their profile and the write succeeds on the primary database, immediately afterward, if they refresh the page, if this is a read, right? When they refresh the page. Now, if this read comes from a replica that hasn't really caught up yet, they may still see outdated information because the latest data is in the primary server and the replica is still having the older data. And this can create confusion because the user will expect to see their updates immediately. For this, a solution could be that after a user performs the right operation, you can temporarily route the user's read to the primary database. And once the replicas catch up and that update is written to all the replicas, then the future reads from that user can return to the replicas. This pattern is what we call read your writes consistency. So basically, you're reading your own writes. And it is ensuring that the users immediately see their own updates. The problem here is the replication is not enough on its own. Replication improves read scalability, but it does not solve storage limitations. Imagine if you now have 100 million users, even with a replica, every database will still store 100 million records. And eventually, your storage limits will be reached and your write throughput will become a bottleneck. And your entire system will become slow. And at this point, you will need a new strategy. And this is where we arrive at a very, very important concept called database sharding. Sharding means splitting the data across multiple independent databases. So before, your databases was carrying all the data of the entire system. But after sharding, they don't have all the data. Instead, the data is stored across multiple shards. And each shard will store only a subset of the total data. Why do we do this? Because this increases our storage capacity, it increases our write throughput, and it gives us better scalability. Usually, what we do is we use replication and sharding together. So basically, if your system is sharded to 3 shards, so each shard will have a replica or 2-3 replicas of its own. Every shard will have a primary database and one or more read replicas. So this will give us both storage scalability and read scalability. Example of sharding strategy are many, but we can start with range-based sharding. For example, let's say we have users data and we have users from A to Z. Right, so shard 1 will have all the users whose name starts with A till M. And shard 2 will have all the users from N to Z. So each shard owns a portion of the data. And each shard has its own range. That's why the range-based sharding. We also have a hash-based sharding. So instead of using a range, what we do is we calculate a hash. So for example, if we have a user ID, right? So we can use user ID modulus the number of shards. And that will give us the shard number. Let's take an example. Let's say that we have a user which is, let's say 21, right? And we have 10 shards. So 21, which is the user ID, modulus the number of shards, which is 10. It will give us 1. So this 1 is the number of shard where this data will be stored. So all the requests 21, 31, 41, 51, all those user IDs will be stored in shard 1. Similarly, all the user IDs with 22, 32, 42 will be stored in shard 2. You don't need to remember all that, but you can remember the formula, which is hash, and hash is whatever you can name it to be, but hash modulo the number of shards you have. This will give you the exact shard number in which your data is stored. The problem with this traditional hashing that we discussed is hash-based sharding works well at the initial level, but when the servers are added or when the servers are removed, our number of shards, the modulo number of shards, that the formula that we were using, this changes, right? So the entire hashing calculation changes, and suddenly a large percentage of the records must move to different servers. And this is very expensive and very disruptive. You will have to replace all the data on all the shards. And to minimize this data movement by changing the number of servers, we use something called consistent hashing. Again, a very, very important concept, so listen very carefully. Instead of placing the servers in a simple list, we actually place them on a virtual ring. And keys are also mapped onto the same ring. Now, each key belongs to the first server encountered while moving clockwise. And to improve the distribution, each of these servers appear multiple times in the ring. This is what we call virtual nodes. The benefits would be better load balancing, fewer hotspots, and an even distribution. When a new server joins, right, let's say a server 4 is added, then only a small subset of keys will need to move. Whereas in traditional hashing, almost all of these keys will need to move. There will be a massive redistribution. In consistent hashing, there is minimal redistribution, and that makes scaling much more efficient. So, taking a look at our architecture, we have a client, we have a load balancer, we have application servers, we have database shards, database replicas. Now let's think of a scenario where a user is uploading a photo. After the upload, we need to resize the image, compress it, we need to generate thumbnails, we need to update the database, and we need to send notifications. Right? We need to do a lot of things for our image upload. But if all of this is happening synchronously meaning at the same time, the user will have to wait for each task to finish. And this will be very frustrating for the user. So the next step in our architecture would be message queues and event-driven architectures. In a synchronous system, every step happens one after the another. For example, first user uploads the photo, then he resizes the image, then the system compresses the image, it generates a thumbnail of that image, it also updates it to the database, it sends an email to the user that the upload has been successful, and then it returns the response, right? And each of these steps will be like somewhere around 200 to 500 milliseconds. So the total wait time will be a lot. We will need to decouple the work. Decoupling means to separate the user-facing actions from the background processing. And this is called event-driven architecture. And the core component that enables you to arrive at this event-driven architecture is a message queue. You must have heard about Kafka and everything. That's a message queue. What it does is instead of performing all the work immediately, the user's request is sent to the application server and from the server to the message queue. And then once it has sent the message to the message queue, application server would simply respond to the user that it's in progress and the upload has been successful. The user has gotten his response and he is free now to scroll away doing whatever he wants to, right? Because the response has been done. Even though the actual processing has not finished yet, that actual processing will be later done by the message queue. What is happening behind the scenes here is, when the user uploaded the photo, the request reached the application server, the server stored the request, it created a job, that job was placed in the message queue and the response was sent, right? So here the response time might be just be 30 milliseconds, which the user can wait. In the background, what's happening is the message queue has various workers, right? Each worker usually consumes the same event and performs its task independently. So there's a queue, we send a request to the queue, and it has a lot of workers who are listening to the queue. And as soon as the message arrives, an appropriate worker will actually fetch this request and do its processing. For example, for uploading an image, there might be an image worker which is listening to the queue, the message queue. And this image worker will basically resize the image, compress the image, generate the thumbnails, all in the background. There might be another worker called the database worker who is listening to any updates on databases. So once the image worker has done its job, it again will send a request back to the message queue that the image has been worked upon. Now the database worker will pick this up and it will update the metadata, it will save the records. And once that database work is done, it will again send the message to the message queue. And now this time it will be picked up by the email worker to send the confirmation email. So all of these tasks can run serially or it can even run in parallel. And this saves us a lot of time. So in synchronous model, things were happening one after the other. In here, things are happening parallelly. And all workers are operating independently of each other. Another major advantage here is the durability. Because once a job is placed in the queue, it will be processed, it will not be lost. The processing might happen several seconds later, but the queue will retain the job. Now, how will this architecture handle the traffic spikes? Look, imagine there are 100 users, now they become million users, right? So servers can get overloaded. But when there's a queue here, all the incoming requests are sent to a queue. And as and when the workers process them, one after the other, the requests get processed. So the queue is also acting as a buffer. Now let's suppose one of the workers of the queue, it crashes. Maybe the image worker crashes. The job is still remaining in the queue, right? So whenever the worker restarts after its crash, it will again pick the job up. And it will just pick up the unfinished work and it will continue processing. So no user intervention is needed. Automatic failure recovery. Let's also see email worker we talked about. If the email worker crashes while sending an email, the message returns to the queue. And the system will automatically retry it later. So the user will never notice any failure. This architecture is also very easy to extend also. For example, later on when there are a lot of users, now you want to analyze things like what sort of users there are. Maybe you created another worker called analytics worker. And now every database entry, its responsibility is logging and monitoring. So no other worker needs any modification. You just added a new consumer to the queue. So the systems are all very loosely coupled. So at one time, if you want to remove the email worker with some other worker, you can do so. Now, when it comes to message queue systems, there are commonly two used solutions, RabbitMQ and Kafka. RabbitMQ is mostly for background jobs and traditional task queues, request processing, and Kafka is mainly used for event streaming, real-time analytics, large-scale applications. Let's spend some more time on Kafka. Kafka is not just a queue, it is basically a distributed, persistent event log. Events in Kafka are stored for extended periods, and the consumers track their own position in the log. So each consumer is reading the data independently. So maybe consumer A is consuming the event 10 and consumer B is consuming the event 200. And there's consumer C who might also be consuming both these events as well, but they are all working independently. Also, consumers can revisit historical events. For example, if something has been read previously by one worker, it can be read again also. Kafka is very popular because it's one of the most widely used event streaming platforms because of high throughput, durability, replayability, and horizontal scalability. So at this point, I would say our architecture is handling requests very, very efficiently. So far, we have been using HTTP requests. And that is what is working, HTTP and HTTPS for most applications. But now we have several different requirements also in real time. For example, your chat applications, live notifications, your multiplayer games, they do not rely on HTTPS or HTTP communications. So there are multiple options available on how real-time communications happen over the internet. The first one we will cover is short polling. In this, the client repeatedly asks the server for any updates. Right? If the server responds no, that's okay. It will ask again a few seconds later. No, okay. Again a few seconds later. And if there's eventually an update, then yes, that update will be given to the client. This works, but mostly the request is returning nothing. So it's just busy waiting and a lot of wasted network traffic. So it's not very efficient. Then we come on to something which is called long polling. Long polling is basically when client asks the server for any update, the server is not responding immediately. Instead, the server is keeping the connection open. So the client doesn't need to ask repeatedly. It asks one time, the server is keeping the connection open, and whenever the new data becomes available, the server sends its response. So this is reducing the unnecessary request, but it is still creating significant connection overhead when you come to scale. But if you want a truly real-time application, your best bet is WebSockets. A WebSocket creates a persistent communication, a persistent connection between a client and a server, and this communication is bidirectional. So both sides can send messages at any time. The benefit of this connection is that there's very low latency. It's a persistent communication and a real-time communication. And this is heavily used in your WhatsApp, in your chat applications, online gaming, even your Uber. Another thing that is usually not very commonly used is server sent events. Server sent events are similar to WebSockets, but here the communication happens only in one direction. Right? Only server is sending the updates to the client. Server is pushing the updates and client cannot push data to the same connection. So this is basically used in live notifications or news feed, stock market updates, those kind of things. One thing that we haven't covered so far are some concepts. First of these concepts are idempotency. Let's say I'm doing a payment, right? I'm paying $100 and the server has processed my payment. However, the network failed before the response would have reached the user. So when I see there is no confirmation, I will click on pay again later. Right? That my $100 have not been debited. I'll click on pay again. And what happens is I've now spent successfully $200. And that is a serious problem. So what we do is we introduce idempotency key. So before sending the request, client generates a unique identifier. So server will store the result against that key. Now, if the same request is arriving again with the same key, then the server will not execute the operation because it's a duplicate operation. It will actually give you the previous result only. It's processing only once the entire workflow, but it's going to be returning many times the same result. This is guaranteeing me that my payment is charged exactly once. So all your Stripe, PayPal, all these payment processing systems are using these idempotency laws. There's another law called the CAP theorem. CAP theorem is not a law but a fundamental concept in distributed systems. So here CAP stands for C, consistency, A, availability, and P, partition tolerance. Consistency is basically every user sees the same data. So there are no stale reads. Always correct data. Availability is the system always responds, even if the response is not perfectly up to date. And partition tolerance means the system continues functioning even when the communication between the nodes break. So even if there's a network failure, it will continue to work because the system is well partitioned. Now, the problem is you cannot fully guarantee all these three simultaneously. A system will be partitioned. Any system is operating at scale will be partitioned. So P will always be there. But either it will be consistent or it will be available. It cannot be both. So you can either prioritize consistency with partition tolerance. That means that if data cannot be guaranteed as correct, we will not response. We will not send any response, like in banking and financial transactions. But AP systems are availability and partition tolerance. That means even if some data is false or outdated, we will still return the response because the availability is the main concern for us. So in social media metrics, where even if there's a stale data, if you have 100 likes instead of 110 likes, it's not a big deal. So there, these things are used. So let's just take a review of the entire architecture that we have built. We have a client, we have a DNS, we have a load balancer, we have certain application servers, we have caches, databases, we have message queues. The databases also have shards and replicas, and we also talked about CDNs. Let's also talk about the problems of the solution. If a single server is overloaded, we do horizontal scaling. For distributing the traffic, we do load balancing. Global latency is solved by CDN. If there's repeated database reads, we use Redis or cache. For database read bottlenecks, we use replication. For size limits, database size limits, we use sharding. For synchronous processing being slow, we introduce message queues. For real-time communication, we use WebSockets. And for duplicate requests, we use idempotency. See, system design is not about memorizing these different components. It's about understanding what kind of problems exist and why the current architecture is breaking, and which component is solving that problem, and what trade-offs that solution introduces. So if you can think in that sequence, you will be able to design scalable systems and answer system design interview questions with a much greater confidence.